The first person in Barrow Creek, Wyoming Territory, to call Hannah Brindle's drainage trench a useless ditch was the alderman himself, a 55-year-old man named Cornelius Thatch, with thinning iron-gray hair, combed back from a high-weathered forehead, and deep-set steel-blue eyes that narrowed whenever he looked at something he believed did not belong in his town. Hannah Brindle arrived in Barrow Creek on the morning stage in the second week of September, 1891. She was 28 years old, 5.5 feet tall, slim-built and sun-weathered, with fair freckled skin and long dark auburn hair pulled back in a low, loose braid that fell past her shoulders. She carried a battered tan leather travel trunk with one broken latch tied with twine, a wooden-handled iron kettle blackened on the bottom, and a folded gray wool blanket draped over her left forearm. She wore a long, ankle-length charcoal gray wool dress with a high cream linen collar buttoned to the throat, a faded oxblood red wool shawl draped over her shoulders and crossed at her chest, a cream linen apron tied at the waist with rust stains on the front, and scuffed dark brown leather lace-up ankle boots. A tarnished brass wedding band circled her left ring finger. A small scar ran along the left side of her jaw. She did not smile at anyone who watched her step off the stage. She rented a room at the Widow McCrae's boarding house at the east end of Main Street, paid 1 month in advance with coin from a small leather pouch, and asked only one question. "Where does the creek go when the snow melts?" The widow blinked at her. Nobody in Barrow Creek asked about creeks. People asked about work, about land prices, about whether the general store carried good tobacco. Hannah Brindle asked about water. The widow pointed north. "Barrow Creek ran along the north edge of town," she said, "coming down from the high country 12 miles upstream. In most years, it stayed inside its banks. In bad years, it rose during the spring thaw and flooded the low pastures behind the livery stable, and once, in 1883, it had come up so fast that the water reached the back steps of the general store and ruined $400 of dry goods." Hannah asked what the town had done about it afterward. "Nothing," the widow said. "The water went down. People dried their things. Life continued." Hannah set her trunk at the foot of the narrow boarding house bed, hung her shawl on the iron hook behind the door, and went outside to walk the creek. She walked the full length of Barrow Creek, where it passed the settlement, nearly half a mile from the upper bend above the sawmill to the lower bend below the cemetery. She crouched at the water line and pressed her fingers into the soil. Sandy loam over dense blue clay. She studied the banks, the slope, the way the land tilted almost imperceptibly toward the water. The town's 26 buildings sat on a gentle shelf between the creek and the hillside, and everything drained north. Every overflow from the creek ran straight through the middle of town. There was no berm, no ditch, no channel, nothing between the water and the front doors of the settlement, but 200 feet of bare open ground. She came back to the boarding house and drew a map on the back of a feed store receipt with a stub of carpenter's pencil. The creek, the town, the slope, the low ground. And then, in a careful arc from the upper bend to the drainage basin below the cemetery, she drew a line. A trench. The next morning she borrowed a spade from the Widow McCrae's tool shed and started digging. Cornelius Thatch noticed 4 days later. He was riding his gray mare along the upper road when he spotted a slim woman in a charcoal gray dress standing waist-deep in a ditch that had not existed the week before. She had dug 52 feet of trench along the base of the slope above the sawmill, 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, with the excavated earth piled neatly along the downhill side in a low berm. She swung the spade with a steady rhythm that said she had done this many times before in many other places. Thatch pulled up his mare and watched for a full minute before he spoke. "What in the name of common sense are you digging?" Hannah straightened, pushed a loose strand of dark auburn hair behind her ear with the back of her muddy wrist, and looked at him with soft hazel eyes that held no deference and no apology. "A drainage trench," she said, "to carry the spring melt around the settlement instead of through it. The creek will flood. It always floods in places like this, where the shelf tilts toward the water. When it does, this trench will catch the overflow at the upper bend and carry it in a clean arc around the buildings and into the old beaver basin below the cemetery. The town stays dry." Thatch stroked his heavy salt and pepper mustache and stared at her the way a man stares at a child drawing battle plans in the dirt. He told her she was tearing up town land without permission. He told her no woman who had been in Barrow Creek less than a week had any authority to rearrange the ground. He told her the creek had caused no serious damage in 8 years and would not cause damage now. Hannah listened. She said nothing. She went back to digging. Thatch rode into town and convened a meeting at the saloon that afternoon. He stood at the bar with his brass alderman's pin and his black hat on the counter and delivered his verdict. The new woman was a nuisance, digging on common land without authorization, making the settlement look foolish. He proposed an order. She would stop digging and restore the ground, or she would leave Barrow Creek within 7 days. The vote was 14-3 in his favor. The 3 dissenters were the widow McCrae, the school teacher, a quiet young woman named Adelaide Sinclair, and old Tom Prentice, a 68-year-old former trapper who had been in the territory since before the war, and who said, in a voice that carried, even though he did not raise it, that he remembered the flood of '83 and that the woman's ditch looked like it might hold water better than anything the town council had ever built, which was nothing. Thatch dismissed him. The motion carried. He delivered the order in person the next morning, riding up to the trench where Hannah had added another 18 feet by lamplight the night before. He read from a paper he had written in his own hand. By order of the Barrow Creek Town Council, she was to cease all excavation on town land immediately, restore the disturbed ground to its original condition, and vacate the settlement within 7 days if she refused. Hannah listened with both hands resting on the spade handle and her hazel eyes steady on his face. When he finished, she asked him one question. "Have you ever seen what happens when an ice dam breaks on a mountain creek in late February?" Thatch folded his paper, tucked it inside his coat, told her she had 7 days, and rode away without answering. She had 6 days left when she walked beyond the boundary of town land and started digging again on the open slope where no council order could reach her. What Cornelius Thatch did not know, what nobody in Barrow Creek knew, was that Hannah Brindle had learned to read water before she learned to read words. Her grandmother had raised her on a small farm outside Chillicothe, Ohio, in the low bottoms of the Scioto River. Every spring, the Scioto rose. Every spring, the fields flooded, black water spreading across the corn rows, filling the root cellar, turning the yard into a shallow brown lake that took weeks to drain. The neighbors accepted it the way they accepted heat in August and ice in January. The river flooded. You dried your things. You replanted life continued. Hannah's grandmother did not accept it. She had come from a family of Pennsylvania Dutch farmers who believed that water was not an enemy, but a border. It would go where you told it if you built the right hallway. Starting in 1861, the year her husband left for the war and did not come back, she began digging drainage trenches around the farm. Not shallow scrapes, proper engineered channels, 3.5 feet deep, lined with creek gravel on the bottom and flat fieldstone on the sides, angled on a grade of 2 inches per rod so the water flowed by gravity without pooling. She built simple sluice gates from rough pine planks hung on pull pegs that a single person could operate from the bank above. By 1870, she had dug 400 feet of trench on 3 sides of the farmhouse. By 72, she had extended the system to protect the barn, the root cellar, and the kitchen garden. The neighbors called her the ditch woman and said she was wasting the good years she had left. Moving dirt the river would fill back in come spring. Then, in the early morning of March the 14th, 1873, the ice dam on the upper Scioto broke. Hannah was 9 years old. She woke to a sound she had never heard before, a deep grinding roar that came from somewhere upstream and shook the farmhouse walls and rattled the tin plates on the shelf above the stove. Her grandmother was already up, already dressed, already standing at the kitchen window with the oil lamp in her hand, watching the dark water rise. A wall of brown water 4 feet high swept through the Scioto bottoms that morning. It hit the neighboring farms with the weight of a locomotive. Root cellars flooded to the ceiling. Barn doors blew inward under the pressure. 3 families lost everything they had built in 20 years. Hannah's grandmother lost nothing. The floodwater hit her trench system at the upper end of the property and split into 2 channels that carried it around the house, around the barn, around the root cellar, and emptied into the low ground on either side. The house stayed dry. The barn stayed dry. The root cellar held every one of its 214 jars on every shelf. Hannah stood at the kitchen door that morning and watched the brown water roar past on both sides of the house, separated from the front porch by 4 feet of rushing current that stayed obediently inside the fieldstone-lined channels. And her grandmother put one hand on her shoulder and said the words that Hannah carried with her for the rest of her life. Water is patient, and water is strong. You cannot fight it. You do not dam it. You give it a road, and you let it go where you tell it to go. Hannah picked up a shovel the next day and started learning. By 16, she could survey a grade by eye and miss the true fall by less than half an inch. She could lay fieldstone without mortar that held against 6 feet of current. She could calculate the flow capacity of a trench from its width, depth, and angle. Her grandmother died the winter Hannah turned 17, quietly, in the rocking chair beside the stove, with the oil lamp burning low. Hannah buried her in the orchard beside her grandfather and said nothing, because her grandmother had taught her that grief was a private season. Then she packed the travel trunk with the iron kettle and the gray wool blanket and left Ohio and went west. She had been reading water and digging trenches in every settlement she passed through ever since. Most of the settlements did not want her help. She gave it anyway. In Barrow Creek, she worked from dawn until the light failed every day through the autumn of 1891. The widow McCrae's husband's brother, a taciturn farmer named Gus McCrae, who lived 4 miles west, brought her a proper long-handled shovel, a mattock with a hickory handle, and a wheelbarrow with an iron wheel, and said nothing except that the ground broke easier when the mattock went first. She started at the upper bend of the creek, 240 yards above the sawmill. She cut the first section of trench along the base of the hillside, 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, graded at 2 inches per rod, with the excavated earth piled on the downhill side as a secondary berm. She lined the bottom with 8 inches of creek gravel hauled by wheelbarrow from a gravel bar downstream. She lined the walls with flat fieldstone from the hillside, stacking each course in an overlapping bond with the stones tilted inward so the earth pressure behind would compress the wall tighter under load. She built 3 sluice gates from rough pine planks, each gate a framed box set into the trench at intervals of 400 feet, hung from a pull peg that one person could yank from the bank above. With the peg pulled, the gate rose on a fieldstone counterweight and the water flowed through. She worked through October. The trench grew, 100 feet, 200, 300, 400, sweeping in a smooth arc along the hillside contour above the settlement. She dug a connecting intake channel from the creek bank, a narrow feeder trench angled to catch the overflow the instant the water rose above normal and funnel it into the main channel. By the end of October, the trench stretched 560 feet, and she had used 340 wheelbarrow loads of gravel and roughly 1,100 flat fieldstones. She also built a shelter. At the midpoint of the arc, where the trench curved around the back of the settlement on a slight rise of dry ground, she constructed a small stone and timber lean-to, 8 feet long and 6 feet wide. She used the same fieldstone lining technique, 2-foot-thick dry-stacked walls on 3 sides, a sloped pine pole roof covered with a layer of sod for insulation, and a heavy plank door on leather hinges. Inside, she placed a small cast-iron camp stove vented through a tin pipe in the roof, a low wooden shelf along one wall, and her provisions, 20 pounds of dried venison, 10 pounds of dried beans, 5 pounds of flour, a sealed crock of lard, 2 jars of preserved choke cherries, a tin of salt, and a brass kettle for boiling water, a single tin oil lamp on the shelf, a folded wool blanket on a narrow wooden bench. It was not a cabin. It was a supply station, a dry, warm place where she could rest during the winter work, and where, if the worst came, she could shelter anyone who needed shelter when the water rose. Nobody in Barrow Creek understood why she was building a stone hut next to a ditch. The blacksmith, a heavy-set man named Orrin Cobb, told the men at the saloon that she was building herself a grave with a roof. The preacher said she ought to spend less time in the mud and more time in prayer. Cornelius Thatch rode past once a week on his gray mare and said nothing, which was worse than mockery, because silence from an alderman meant he had decided you did not exist. November brought the first hard frost. The topsoil froze 6 inches deep, and the spade bounced off the ground like iron hitting iron. Hannah switched to the mattock, breaking the frozen crust in short, vicious swings before scooping the loosened earth with the shovel. When the frost went deeper, she built small, hot fires of pine knots and dry brush in the trench ahead of her excavation, and let them burn for 2 hours to thaw the earth before she dug. She wrapped her hands in strips of wool and kept working. Her boots cracked at the seams. Her apron stiffened with frozen clay every morning and had to be beaten soft before she could tie it. She worked through December. On Christmas Day, she dug 40 feet of trench, while the rest of Barrow Creek gathered at the church for the holiday service and the potluck supper afterward. Nobody invited her. The widow McCrae left a plate of roast venison and boiled turnips on her boarding house doorstep. Adelaide Sinclair left a pair of hand-knitted wool gloves on the staircase with a note that said only, "Your work matters." Old Tom Prentice walked out to the trench in the cold afternoon light and stood watching for 10 minutes with his hands in his coat pockets before he said, quietly, that it was the best piece of ditch work he had seen since Pennsylvania. Hannah thanked him. She kept digging. By the middle of January, the trench was 1,200 feet long. It ran in a continuous fieldstone-lined arc from the intake at the Upper Creek Bend, along the base of the hillside behind every building in the settlement, past the stone shelter at the midpoint, around the lower end of town, and emptied into the old beaver basin below the cemetery. The 3 sluice gates were installed and tested. She had hauled buckets of water from the creek and poured them into the upper end to verify the grade, adjusting the angle in 2 places where the flow pooled instead of running clean. She had checked every fieldstone wall segment for loose stones and reset 14 that had shifted in the freeze-thaw cycle. 1,200 feet of hand-dug, fieldstone-lined, gravel-bedded drainage trench with 3 wooden sluice gates and a stone supply shelter. Capacity at full flow, 400 cubic feet of water per minute by her calculation. Enough to divert a moderate spring flood entirely. Enough to reduce a catastrophic one to something survivable. She walked the full length on a cold gray January afternoon, checking every joint, every gate, every stone. Then she went back to the boarding house and slept for 12 hours. February came bitter and still. The creek froze at the edges but kept running dark and fast in the center channel. Upstream in the high country, the snowpack had been building since November. Heavy wet snow that froze and compacted and froze again until the old-timers said it was the deepest pack in 20 years. The creek's flow had been dropping since late December as more water froze into the pack instead of running down. On the second Sunday of February, Hannah walked upstream alone for 2 miles through knee-deep snow to the narrows where the canyon walls pinched the creek into a passage 12 feet wide. She found what she had feared. A wall of ice spanned the creek from bank to bank, jammed behind a massive fallen cottonwood that had wedged between 2 boulders in the throat of the narrows. The ice wall was 9 feet high and still growing, layered with frozen slush and broken branches and compacted snow. Behind the dam, the water was pooling, a dark, expanding reservoir filling the narrow valley above the narrows, rising an inch every hour, pressing against the ice with a weight that Hannah estimated at 30 tons per linear foot. She came back to Barrow Creek and told the widow McCrae first. Then she went to the saloon and told anyone who would listen. The ice dam at the Narrows was going to break. It might hold another week. It might hold another day. When it broke, every gallon impounded behind it, thousands of gallons, tens of thousands, was going to come down Barrow Creek in a single wave and hit the town with more water than the flood of '83. Nobody listened. The blacksmith said she was trying to scare people into respecting her ditch. The preacher said only God sent floods and only God prevented them. Cornelius Thatch laughed out loud in the saloon and proposed a toast to the woman who predicted disasters to justify her useless excavations. On the 23rd of February, at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning, the ice dam broke. Hannah heard it from her bed in the boarding house. A deep, grinding roar from the high country that shook the window glass and rattled the stovepipe and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She was out of bed and into her boots before the second wave of sound arrived. She pulled her shawl over her shoulders, grabbed the oil lamp, and ran through the dark toward the upper intake of her trench. The water hit the settlement 7 minutes after the dam broke. A wall of dark, icy water and shattered ice 5 feet high came surging down the creek bed at the speed of a galloping horse, carrying broken timber, uprooted brush, boulders the size of barrels, and slabs of ice 4 inches thick. It hit the banks at the upper bend and overflowed instantly, pouring across the flat ground in a spreading brown flood that reached the first buildings within 60 seconds. But it also hit the intake of Hannah's trench. She had sprinted to the first sluice gate and pulled the peg with both hands. The counterweight lifted the pine plank gate, and the water poured into the intake channel with a sound like a locomotive hitting a river. It hit the main diversion trench and roared south along the arc, 400 cubic feet per minute of brown icy water churning through the Fieldstone line channel, carrying ice chunks and sticks and gravel, but flowing clean and fast along the engineered grade without overtopping the walls. She ran to the second gate and pulled it, then the third. The full system was open. Water roared through 1,200 feet of trench in a continuous sheet. The town still flooded. She had never claimed the trench could stop the creek. No hand-dug channel could capture the full output of a catastrophic ice dam break. But it diverted enough. The water on Main Street rose to 14 inches instead of 5 feet. The general store lost 2 barrels of flour on the bottom shelf instead of its entire ground floor inventory. The livery stable held. The boarding house held. The church held. The sawmill lost a rack of planks but kept its frame. Not a single building was destroyed. In 1883, the last bad flood, 3 buildings had been condemned, and 1 had collapsed entirely. This time, the damage was mud on the floors and wet goods on the lowest shelves, and 14 inches of cold brown water that people waded through in their boots with their children on their shoulders. Because 1,200 feet of useless trench was carrying a river around their town and dumping it into the old beaver basin below the cemetery, where it spread into a wide, shallow lake that would drain into the ground over the next 4 days. Dawn came gray and cold. The water was already dropping. People came out of their houses and stood in the receding flood on Main Street and looked north toward the creek and then south toward the hillside, where a roaring brown channel of diverted water curved in a smooth arc behind every building and disappeared around the lower end of town. Old Tom Prentice was the first to walk to the trench. He stood at the upper intake in the pale gray light with his hands in his coat pockets and watched the water pour through and shook his head slowly and said, loud enough for the 5 men behind him to hear, that it was the finest piece of water engineering he had seen in 40 years in the territory. Adelaide Sinclair was the second. She brought a tin cup of hot coffee and stood beside Hannah at the second sluice gate and pressed the cup into her shaking hands and did not speak, because some things do not improve with words. The widow McCrae was the third. She brought a dry wool blanket and a bowl of hot bean soup carried in a towel, and stood beside Hannah and said that the boarding house was warm and dry, and that her room was waiting whenever she was ready. Then people began arriving at the stone shelter. Hannah opened the plank door and let them in. The blacksmith's wife with her 2 small children, the preacher with wet boots and a stunned expression, 3 families from the low end of Main Street whose ground floors were still draining. She lit the camp stove and boiled water for broth and sliced dried venison onto tin plates and heated beans and ladled preserved choke cherries into cups 14 people sat or stood in the small stone shelter that morning, warm and dry while the floodwater receded outside, eating food that Hannah Brindle had stored there 3 months earlier because her grandmother had taught her that when you build a road for water, you also build a roof for people. The last person to come was Cornelius Thatch. He came on foot, not on his gray mare. He waded through the thinning flood on Main Street in his scuffed black boots and his long charcoal black frock coat, the tarnished brass alderman's pin catching the flat gray light. His black hat was in his right hand. His steel blue eyes were not narrowed. They were open and still. He walked past the general store, past the livery stable, past the church where the preacher swept brown water from the steps. He walked all the way up the slope to the stone shelter where Hannah Brindle stood in the doorway with her boots caked in mud, her oxblood shawl soaked through, her dark auburn braid heavy with mist, and her hazel eyes the same as they had always been, calm, resolute, and unwilling to smile for a man who had not yet earned it. Thatch stopped 6 feet from her. He looked at the trench. He looked at the water still roaring through it, brown and fast and obedient. He looked at the Fieldstone walls holding firm. He looked at the sluice gates standing open. He looked at the stone shelter behind her, where 14 people sat in the warmth eating food she had put there before the first snow fell. He took his hat and held it against his chest with both hands. "I was wrong," he said. He did not qualify it. He did not explain. He said 3 words and stood there with his steel blue eyes on her face and waited for whatever she chose to give him in return. Hannah looked at him. She did not gloat. She did not lecture. She did not remind him of the council vote or the 7-day order or the toast he had raised in the saloon. She looked at him the way her grandmother had looked at the floodwater, with patience and with the understanding that some things have to find their own level before they can be still. Then she stepped aside, held the door open, and told him there was hot bean soup on the stove and dried venison on the shelf, and that he was welcome to sit down. Cornelius Thatch set his alderman's hat on the wooden bench, unbuttoned his wet frock coat, sat down on an upturned Fieldstone beside the cast-iron stove, and accepted a tin cup of hot broth from the woman he had ordered out of town. 3 days later, when the water had drained and the mud was drying, and the people of Barrow Creek began repairing the small damages that 14 inches of flood had left behind, damages that would have been 5 feet of total destruction without the trench, Cornelius Thatch called a meeting at the saloon and proposed, in his own voice, that the settlement formally recognize Hannah Brindle's drainage system as critical public infrastructure, that she be granted permanent residence and first rights to any parcel of land within the boundary, and that the town council allocate labor and materials to help her maintain the trench every autumn going forward. The vote was unanimous. Hannah chose a 1/4 acre at the upper bend of the creek beside the intake of her trench. She built a small cabin with a stone hearth and a single window facing east. She planted a kitchen garden in the spring. She maintained her trench every autumn, clearing debris, resetting Fieldstone, checking the sluice gates, adjusting the grade where the freeze-thaw had shifted the gravel. The trench held again in 1893 when the late spring thaw brought the creek up 4 feet above normal. It held in 95 when 3 days of warm rain on deep snowpack sent a surge that would have put water into every building on Main Street. It held every year because Hannah Brindle had built it the way her grandmother built the ditches in the Scioto bottoms, 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, Fieldstone lined, gravel bedded, graded at 2 inches per rod. with sluice gates that one person could operate from dry ground. Water is patient and water is strong. You do not fight it. You do not dam it. You give it a road and let it go where you tell it. Hannah Brindle gave it a road, and Barrow Creek never flooded again.